let's get started. Sorry. So we have a couple of topics. So the first topic is getting more Imba contributors. Currently, if we look at Imba repository, I'm just gonna, let's see, hopefully nothing weird comes up. Imba, there. So if we look at the package JSON file, we currently have a couple of contributors and only 2 are active currently.
Yep.
So that's not a big issue currently, since Imba is mostly working fine, but it would be nice to get more contributors. If we look at the contributors, not everyone is active, and I don't think we should assume that anyone is coming back. It would be fantastic if some of these people, I don't know them that well, so
I think most of these are relatively like minor contributions, and we do have more contributions that we just haven't added to the list of contributors in package JSON. But most of them are like small changes. We do have a few. There are a few people who have forked Imba and created like the slots implementation and things like that, and those are people that would be really nice to get into the development of Imba 2. So there are people who have actually dug into the source code of Imba in depth, I think.
Yeah, so another thing we could also do is try to include them in topics.
Yeah.
So we could have some more meetings where we have topical meetings. For example, Eric is really into the documentation.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I was thinking, maybe try to have some documentation related meetings, but you could also have other meetings where the topic is XYZ.
Yeah.
Let's say, for example, decorator syntax.
Yeah.
And we don't need to go crazy where we have working groups or groups, but I think it's useful to have like a focused meeting for, let's say, 20 to 1 hour or something. And this is the topic, here's some code, here's some switching between the screens.
Yep.
And let's discuss. Sorry.
I agree.
So we could try to schedule topical meetings before Imba 2 is released.
Yeah.
And I also think it's interesting, for example, for marketing purposes. So like how are you supposed to try to recruit new contributors? Or what's a good way to make a good messaging? So so that we can actually reach out to those. And also with regards to documentation, I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done that's auto-generated now that the type doc or the JS doc things are going to become possible. We could actually do a lot of cool things with here's a way to document the code and then enforce that and then start generating stuff from that. So I'm very interested in those things, and I think I could try to schedule a couple of meetings related to that. Because have you tried Dash?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're familiar with docset format?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used it a lot before.
Yes. So I'm a huge fan of docset. Easy to search, easy to navigate. I'm not saying it's for everybody, but if you sit a lot with APIs and so on, then it's nice to just jump. I want to see what this is. And I think if we like create a lot of examples in combination with generated stuff, or maybe we could have examples just inlined in the comment. And then, so do you have anything more to add to get more Imba contributors?
No, I agree. And especially about the topical meetings, I can already think of a few different topical meetings that make sense in the near future. One of them is decorators, like the decorator syntax, discussions about that. Another is the syntax for slots, because right now we support slots using kind of the HTML way, the web component syntax. But I think there are some nicer alternatives that we should talk about and discuss, and maybe we can come up with other approaches. So yeah, there are some pros and cons of using the syntax we have today, and one of the problems with it is that we actually override the native. So like when web components actually become a big thing, we do a lot of custom things when you use the slot type of the slot tag and things like that. So you won't be able to in Imba to use the native slots and native implementation of slots. Yeah, that was kind of confusing, but
no,
I can try.
I'm going to listen to the recording later, so it's still early in the morning. So,
yeah, you probably won't understand it then either. But yeah, it is a problem. I think we should have a custom syntax for both defining the slots and defining what content goes in.
Yeah, I think I have to sit down with the problem and think about it more.
Yeah.
But yeah, there you have some topics. And also we could figure out how you can get access to the Zoom account. So if you feel comfortable with that, we could also try to record those sessions.
Yeah.
And publish.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's that. We could move on to the next topic. And I think we are going to come back to that topic again in the future. At least I'm very interested in it. And there's a lot of things that can be improved with tooling. Like also, I look forward to when we have maybe a Firefox tool where extension that is Imba specific and does some Imba useful things, or maybe generating output so it's more compatible with other plugins. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's cool. Then there's the analyzer output. So let me open up the issue here. Analyzer. So this was something you suggested back in November.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, so as I tried to explain there are basically two steps. And the first step is to just convert existing Imba code in a way that's where it still runs in the current version of Imba, but where it is more verbose, like explicit self, explicit parentheses and stuff like that, which makes it a lot easier to actually convert it to Imba 2 code. So you will need fewer manual changes. And then the next step would be to also make some breaking changes to the code, like create the Imba 2 version of that file. Like we don't support the colon syntax at all anymore in Imba 2 for accessors. So if the formatter also changed the dot accessors to the colons to regular dot accessors, then the code will obviously break.
So maybe this is so maybe we should add that. So related to the indentation thing. So maybe this tool, maybe we could create a tool which does all of this.
Yeah.
So it either like basically what it does is it's going to rewrite your code.
Yeah. Yeah, but we need, so it's definitely valuable with a tool like that. But in that type of tool, we obviously need to be able to define the settings we want. Like, do you want to always insert implicit self and these things?
Yeah. But we could have a same default.
Yeah.
And then here is either command line options or a configuration file you pass in.
Yeah.
I think this is like something that can be totally separate from the Imba.
Yeah. That being said, in Imba 2, there is fewer, like all of the implicit things that create ambiguity in Imba 1 doesn't exist anymore in Imba 2. So in Imba 2, this would be more like just for indentation and maybe a few other formatting things.
Yeah.
In Imba 2, there are no. Yeah, there are some things like, do you want to add parentheses around function arguments in function definitions? There are things like that where it might make sense to let people use a formatter to make the code consistent, I guess.
Yeah, but I think it should have a default, and then everything else is overridable.
Yeah.
So if you run the tool, you're not asked anything.
Yeah.
Only when you say, hey, my tool, initialize it, or create a new configuration somehow, then it should start asking you stuff or telling you to configure it.
It makes sense in the same, like we're working on the VS Code plugin now, and making that a lot more advanced, using the type inference and auto completions and things like that. And one important part of VS Code is exactly that, like document formatting. Most plugins for most languages have a document formatter that VS Code plugs into, where you just use a single button in VS Code to reformat the code. And for that, this type of tool would be
one thing, the tool could be either used as a CLI or it could be used as a library. So or you could make it that way.
Yeah, I agree.
So is the source mapping stuff done? So we can start.
So it's not really about source mapping. We have all the tokens in the stream are correctly labeled, like they have a location and a length and all that. So yes, all of that is available, but a lot of it is not exposed by the analysis. But if we create a tool like this, we wouldn't use the analyzer anyways. We would probably just use the compiler and the token stream and find things. So it does make sense to use the analyzer mode for this, I guess. It makes more sense to just parse the code using the lexer and then run through the tokens and make changes. So we can get back to that. I guess that's a separate meeting altogether, where we need to sit down and go through the actual challenges and how we're going to solve them.
Yeah, so do you want to go through the issues first? Or do you have a clearer picture with regards to what should be deferred to after?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we have enough issues to really have that discussion. Like, I don't think we have all of I haven't been smart enough to actually add the issues for all of the things that we need to think about in relation to version 2. But also I cannot see that many features or bigger aspects that remains and that I will take a long time. It's basically what can be deferred to post 2.0. The only things remaining before 2.0 now is basically testing and creating some real world applications to find some blocking problems and things, if you understand.
I understand, but I'm like I would consider going through like what is remaining and considering is this something that should be added? Like, for example, the syntax on decorator stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's cool. I don't really think it's essential, but I don't.
So it's completely essential it's completely essential for us to be able to start rewriting our code from Imba 1 to Imba 2. And I think that's an important signal. If we can't really use it for the real world things that we've used Imba for several years now, then those are obviously like critical missing things. And it is working now. It's just a matter of the syntax. So we could ship it without thinking about the syntax and just keeping the existing decorator syntax, but it wouldn't be an option to release 2.0 and then disable decorators altogether, because then we couldn't use it ourselves.
Yeah, but we don't, with regards to the approach, we don't need to start using Imba 2 for everything. We could, I think there is value in trying to introduce Imba 2 gradually into an existing Imba code base, because if you think about it.
Yeah, but even then, if we don't, I'm just saying, if we don't have decorators, then that's almost impossible. And the reason for that is that one of the strengths of Imba 1 was that you had executable class bodies. So it was easy to kind of create your own DSLs, to define custom types of fields, default properties, things like that. And we rely heavily on those things in basically every part of our applications, like Scrimba and GitSpeak. So yes, we could create tiny, small, isolated parts of the applications into Imba 2. Mm-hmm. But for me, it doesn't make sense at all to release that as a 2.0, knowing that we basically cannot do 90% of what we could do in Imba 1, especially when it is actually working. I see no reason to rush that out. Like Imba 2 would be much, much better if we tried to convert a medium-sized application from Imba 1 to Imba 2 and making sure that actually works and makes sense, all the concepts, before releasing version 2. Because there's no reason to release something that is like far inferior to the previous version. Then you get a lot, even more like, what do you call it? Not separation.
Divergence?
Yeah, divergence and chaos.
Yeah, okay,
So,
I see. I get the point.
Yeah.
But okay, so when do you think we should ask people to start rewriting things in Imba 2?
I think we should very soon gear up our own experimentation with Imba 2, and then also start asking people at the same time, but without documentation, it's probably hard for them. So we need to work on adding more tests, more examples, and actually start working on the documentation. And I see the documentation as kind of the last step now before releasing Imba 2. So I see it as nearly feature complete, except for just general problems that you run into. If you catch my drift, like I implemented SSR now this weekend. So now we also have server-side rendering, just a relatively simple implementation.
Yeah, I totally get it. I'm just trying to think about how many bugs have I seen, and how many of them haven't I reported yet. So that's something I need to.
Yes, so I think we're moving over to that phase now, where we actually need to really get into the problems and the how do you build an Imba 2 application? How do you test these things in the real world? Because then you always run into a lot of problems that you didn't think about. And these problems that we then run into, I think, are critical to fix before an official full launch. So yeah.
Cool. So I have some ideas for the documentation, which I've talked about, but I want to save them for later so we can discuss them separately. But I think like we can come up with a really nice solution which will work well in practice. So do you want to do the full Imba 2 status now?
We could. I haven't really prepared for it, but
you already made an issue about it, so
yeah, that's true.
We could walk through that one.
Yeah, maybe we could just take it as part of the walkthrough of currently open Imba issues.
We can start with that one.
Yeah. Should
I can stop sharing the screen soon.
Yeah, maybe I should start sharing the screen. Let me see if you stop. And I start. Desktop 2, I guess.
Okay.
So you can see it now?
Yes, I can see it.
So let's see. This was the issue we talked about earlier now about the analysis. It's not much more about that. Should I just go through the issues?
No, let's start with the status.
Okay.
So we can actually get the status. It's the most important thing.
Yeah. So the status here is, the text is kind of small, I guess. Maybe we can. No, that's not what I want.
Just dev tools.
Yeah. I guess people can read it. Okay. They can go to the issues themselves as well. So there are a ton of improvements in version 2. So there are still some problems that make it kind of challenging to use, but overall, when we get like the final polish and testing and documentation, it is a vastly improved version of the language. And one of the major things is that we are moving in the direction of using ES6 and newer JavaScript features, because that's been one of the challenges with Imba, is that it was started so long ago. It was started when JavaScript was still really shitty. And after that mostly due to CoffeeScript, I think, JavaScript evolved and implemented a lot of new things, and Imba didn't change with it. So we still compiled everything to prototypes, ES5. We had our own complex implementations of default arguments in functions, splats or spread operators, loops, all of that. So in version 2, we are trying to close the gap with ES6. So we are now compiling a lot of things to their native ES6 equivalent and removing a lot of complicated stuff in the compiler at the same time. So we have implemented support for template strings. There are some things that are still not supported there, but mostly it's just like you can now use backticks as you did in doing ES6 for the template strings. You could always do template strings in Imba with double quotes, but this compiles to actual template strings, and there are some differences. And one of the more important improvements is that we now support object destructuring everywhere, like you have in ES6, which is a pattern that people have really picked up on and started using extensively. It's useful, yeah, a ton of places. So decorators as well. So Imba version 1 had executable class bodies and tag declaration bodies like Ruby, which made it easy to, you could define static methods on classes, subclass them, and actually use all of these static methods in the class body. So to define custom types of fields, to set some default parameters setup. Now that we have moved to ES6 classes, that is no longer possible. So decorators is a very nice replacement for that, I think, where you can actually like define functions that wrap and extend and change the functionality of getters and setters and functions, etc. So I won't go through all of the decorator stuff now. You could read up on it on the Mozilla Developer Network or tons of other places, but it's a really useful addition. Another thing is iterators. Like we had from the beginning, we have a different syntax for loops where you have for in and for on off, which compiles to a native, like really simple for loop in JavaScript. But now, so that was an actual need in JavaScript. It was complicated to loop through arrays and objects and other iterable things in a consistent manner. So iterators was introduced with the for off loop. And now we have implemented that as well. So if you just do for off like you would in JavaScript, it will compile to a native for off loop. And at the same time, we also then support defining iterator functionality on your own classes in Imba to make your own type of objects iterable. Class fields, it is kind of the alternative to props that you had in Imba 1.
So are props going to disappear then?
Are
they going to be
gone? I think so.
The keyword is gone.
The keyword is gone, I think. The attribute keyword, like attr, might still be there for tags, but we'll see about that as well. It might be replaced with just a built-in decorator. So class fields, private class fields. The private class fields are kind of like instance variable were in Imba 1. It's also an important and valuable addition. ES6 classes, we're compiling classes to ES6 now, and we also support the full import-export syntax from ECMAScript modules. And we also, like now it is very much one-to-one mapping to the syntax in JavaScript. And one challenge we have now is that our compiler basically just compiles to the ESM syntax. But for things to work directly in Node without going through rollup or another bundler, then we might also want to make the compiler support compiling to CommonJS modules as well. That is one of the things that we can discuss. Maybe it should just be postponed and let people, if you want to use Imba 2 on the server side, then you should use a build step to actually like bundle your Node application as well, just as you do.
If we provide a template, like
yeah,
this is the base you use, then here,
yeah,
everything is set up. If you're gonna do something custom, figure it out on your own.
Yeah. The annoying thing with that, and I completely agree that we could definitely do that for 2.0. The only annoyance there is that when you have smaller Imba scripts, like let's say you have an application and you also have a scripts folder where you have a lot of Imba scripts that require or import things from your application, then that will be very complicated and cumbersome to make work, because you would essentially need to bundle each of the scripts to run them in Node. That's one of the main challenges as I see it. Yeah, tag improvements, support for slots. It's obviously a pretty big thing. Support for fragments. It's kind of just a syntax thing, but for grouping, yeah, it's not really something we need to talk about, but it's there. We compile our tags now to native web components, and one of the cool things is that an Imba tag now is the actual DOM element. In comparison to before, it was actually a tiny wrapper object that added a lot of logic, and then we created a DOM element, and then we mapped those two together, like they were linked together. And the problems with that is that it uses quite a lot more memory, and it requires us to add a lot of proxy functions and getters and setters and stuff from the tag wrapper.
I really think it's a cool improvement, because now you could actually just use Mozilla documentation.
Yeah.
And then you just have, oh, wow, now you can just write that. Oh, I have the children.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I have these things, and
yeah.
And also it just works.
Yeah, and it's even, I could bring up like the VS Code plugin as well. Like now I'm in a tag root, and just if I do, it basically includes all the, you get auto completion and validation, diagnostics and stuff for all the actual, actual properties of the DOM elements. Yeah. So it's much better in every way. There are some challenges with it, and that is that since we compile to native web components, we need an additional layer for older browsers that doesn't support web components. That's not something we're going to do before 2.0 at all.
Wait. So you're talking about legacy stuff.
Yeah, if you want to run an Imba 2 project in an older browser, if you do rendering on the server side, then it's perfectly fine. But if you want to do like an interactive application on the client for browsers that doesn't support web components at all, then you will need to use some kind of shim layer. And
So if someone cares about that, they will have to contribute changes themselves.
And one of the plans with version 2, you can always disagree about that, but one of the plans there is that we want to create the perfect language essentially for creating these rich applications. And we want to be future oriented. So there are now so many cool things that are coming out and that are even supported in most browsers today. Like most relatively new browsers support a ton of interfaces that people still doesn't really use, that we can expose in a very user-friendly way in Imba. And one of the things is like, just as an example, resize observer is now supported in most browsers, and it's coming to iOS Safari as well very soon. And you do have shims that work, but in Imba you can have, we introduced like, instead of needing to create the resize observer, add the element to that, set up the bindings and the events, you can essentially just write resize, do something. Now the syntax highlighting is kind of broken, but it will just hook up as a resize event, and Imba will then automatically set up a resize observer and do all the things behind the scenes. The same goes for intersection observer. You could do that with mutations, like mutation, and hook up something that for you as a developer just looks like a regular event. Then Imba can use these cool features behind the scenes. So our goal, getting back to that, is our goal is to be future oriented. We don't want to support older versions of Internet Explorer and things, because we think there are so many great new features that if you just embrace the fact that you are not going to support the 5% of the oldest browsers out there, then you can do a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, you can really do a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah.
And if you just browse the various APIs available for HTML, JavaScript, CSS, you're going to see there's a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah. You're also going to see in the future like tighter integration with CSS variables as well in Imba 2. And that's another perfect example. Like CSS variables are supported essentially everywhere, and they are extremely powerful.
So that's post 2.0.
Yeah, that's post 2.0. But it already works well with the scoped CSS, inline scoped CSS, and also we do have support for that now. That if you here like write count with double dash, that's not. And nothing is documented, but I mean, that is kind of just supported now as an experimental thing, but that will already compile to actually setting the CSS variable count on this object. So if many people think that CSS variables are like, oh, we already have variables in less and Sass and SCSS and all of these preprocessors, but it's a totally different game. CSS variables are much more powerful and support so many other patterns of development.
Cool.
Yeah. This is taking a long time.
Yeah, but we have a lot of time left.
Yeah. So since we compile to native web components, we get really performant and consistent mount and unmount behavior for free. That's very cool because the tag manager in Imba 1 was kind of not that buggy, but there are so many edge cases. But now everything works consistently. We have dynamically named tags, which is actually something quite a few people have requested and that I have seen the need for myself in a lot of the things that we write in Imba. And that is to, with the compact tag syntax, be able to just inline use, like look up kind of a custom tag type. So especially when you loop through a lot of items, that each item should basically spawn a different type of tag based on their kind attribute or something, then this is a nice way to do it. Functional tag components, we can get back to that later, but it's essentially kind of the same thing as you have with Vue and
Well, what does it mean?
React. It means that you can, so if I create a function here, so this is just a test, it looks very messy, but I could essentially create a function here, def something where I take in some data or yeah, whatever. And if data tests one div span test data title else div not found. This is just an example, but it's essentially kind of a fragment of a element, and you can, inside of a tag tree, just include that as a function, like call that function here, and everything inside of this will be memoized in the context of this rendering and work just like if you inline here added that code. And that is valuable if you have helper methods where you have something that you reuse a lot, but that doesn't necessarily warrant a custom tag type. Then this makes a lot of sense. So
yeah, I see.
Yeah. Memoization everywhere, yeah, that's another thing. That was one of the bigger like problems in Imba, is essentially that people could create like def footer blah 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 somewhere in their application, and then inside of the render method they call self footer, and this would seem to work in Imba 1, but it would just be extremely inefficient because it wouldn't memoize this element here, so that every time you call render, it would basically recreate the whole footer and recreate a lot of elements and replace them. And it creates very weird and unexpected behavior if you don't really know how this works. But in Imba 2, since we do context-based memoization everywhere, so we use a trick in the compiler to actually always, if you call this function from different locations in different contexts, then it will create new tag trees. But if you like recall the same function from the same spot in your code, it will reuse the same tag tree with the memo DOM kind of concept. So yeah, it's not, I really need to work on that explanation, but it is very nice in Imba 2 that you don't need to worry about things like that. It's just things will work as you expect when you look at the code, as opposed to some parts of Imba.
Nice.
Improved event handling with modifiers. That's something we should definitely add a lot of documentation for examples for, but the whole event modifier things have been vastly improved, and it includes a lot of cool features that we can get back to, where you can pass in like lazy variables arguments into your event handlers, where you can basically chain different event modifiers and handlers, and if they return promises, the next thing will wait to be called until the promise of the previous item was called. Just as an example, here, let's say you have some sort of form and you have a submit event. Then you could, let's say you want to prevent the default behavior, like suppress the default event. Then you would call submit something, blah, 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 which basically will call like the submit something method that is defined somewhere up the chain of tags. But then you can also like enable form, do whatever. And if these return promises, it will actually wait with calling the next thing in the pipeline until the promise is resolved from the previous one. And you can also specify that this should take the previous result as an argument.
Yeah, so this is really powerful, and we should definitely document this.
Yeah,
because it's not obvious.
And it's extremely powerful, especially for like throttle is custom, like a event modifier that comes with Imba 2, where you can also add some properties to that, where you say that if this method is called many times in a row, it will just silence everything until it will wait 100 milliseconds or something before you can actually emit the event again. And you can also define behavior where you say that it should add a class to this element all the way until every method in the event chain has resolved. So if you have a promise where you submit something, it's really, really easy. It's just a simple modifier to add a disabled class to the whole form until it's finished with the event handling chain. So yeah, it's good. It needs to be documented, but it's extremely powerful, and it's 100% based on the needs we have had when we've developed Scrimba and GitSpeak from Imba 1. And the last thing that is also something we need to get back to is that it has insane performance. And I really mean, like, it's insane. Imba 1 was extremely fast, especially for real world cases. It didn't show that much if you had a test where you just create 1,000 elements in 10 milliseconds and then just see, oh, is this faster than React or other frameworks? Yes, it was fast there as well. But most of the time in these benchmarks are obviously spent creating the real elements and doing, interacting with the DOM in the browsers. So in Imba 2, we have rewritten the whole type compilation. So it's using an approach where it essentially doesn't create any garbage anymore between renderers. So if your data hasn't changed and you re-render something, the re-rendering will not create any garbage objects that need to be dealt with by the garbage collector. And that is important because when you allow yourself to re-render a whole application from root very often, then most of the time, most of the data will not have changed. And if your rendering creates a lot of garbage, then obviously the garbage collector will kick in regularly. And also we have managed to move away from using, from actually calling functions and adding closures around loops and things like that. So it's just extremely bare bones. It's kind of compiled to a, it looks very obscure, but it is, I think it is closing in on being like the optimal way you could update a DOM tree efficiently. And I'm looking very much forward to showing the performance of it and also explain in more detail how it works. Because now it crushes, like it crushes even libraries like Svelte and Vue 3 and the others even in the plain benchmarks where it doesn't do that much.
But like, I think it's fine that we don't claim that it's readable anymore, the compiler output. That's not important. Like for us, like, yeah, if you want to debug something, you're going to look at the compile output.
Yeah.
But if the tooling is going to improve, which it's certainly doing right now, then like bugs are going to be obvious. Like the tooling is going to show you, here's the bug. You're never going to need to look at the compile output. Yeah. Like unless you're an Imba contributor upstream.
Yeah. And one thing that we haven't added to this list of improvements because it was done after I wrote this is that we now have much better source mapping. So a result of that is that you can now actually step through your code with source maps so that you actually debug your Imba code instead of the JavaScript code. And that could also easily work in Node as well. So you can get correct line mappings to errors and that was a problem with Imba 1 that we didn't really, the source mapping wasn't detailed enough. So it would kind of break down in many scenarios, which made it not usable in my opinion. But now it is much better.
Nice.
So this is taking, how much time do we?
We only have 12 more minutes.
Okay.
So we can, let's go through the breaking changes.
Yeah, the breaking changes, that's difficult to do fast.
Very fast,
very fast. So implicit self is removed. So now you actually need to use self.identifier or @identifiers to reference a property on self. And that was from back in the day from inspired by Ruby that we had implicit self. And we needed the @ to separate instance variables and actual methods. Yeah. So Now it's more like CoffeeScript now, where you can always look at the code and the @ symbol is always just an alias basically for this dot or self dot.
Yeah, and this is a really easy thing to be covered by the formatter. And also in the VS Code extension, we can have like fixed in place, like we can actually see what it is, and then you just fix it for me, and it's going to rewrite the source code.
Implicit calling is also removed. So if you want to call a function, a method without any arguments, then you have to use parentheses at the end, like you do in most languages. But again, you don't do that in Ruby. But since JavaScript you so often access properties instead of calling methods, then it makes sense to move in this direction so that we don't. Then we get rid of the whole colon versus dot syntax for property access, which has been probably the main confusion for new and experienced and veteran Imba users. Remove prop syntax, replaced with class fields, and decorators. Symbols deprecated. That's just because I don't see the need for it now. The fewer concepts we have, the better. Then we can use that for something else later. It will still work, but it is deprecated, and it will show warnings in the compiler. Key tags would change the syntax for like dynamically keyed elements in loops and whatnot. This one I might revert, or at least like allow both for a while. The constructors are defined with def constructor instead of def initialize.
Like, this could be covered by def rewriting tool.
Yeah.
And I prefer having it consistent. Like, this is the way you do it.
Yeah.
Def constructor. No, in it.
Yeah.
It's def constructor, or just pick one.
Yeah, I kind of agree.
Because think about
I think it's just I've written so much Imba code over the last years that I still write initialize so often. But as long as I get used to writing constructor instead, I'm sure it's perfectly fine. Then you can also still use initialize as a name for a function that, I see there are a lot of languages where you have constructors where they also have an initialize method that does something else. That's actually an argument for changing it to constructor. Next one, just to move more in line with ES6, we use spread syntax, like 3 dots instead of splats, like in Ruby. I guess people will have different opinions about that, but I think it's nice to move in the direction of ES6, not with all the braces and verbose formatting and that kind of stuff, but just the concepts that could map basically one-to-one with an existing ES6 concept, then I think we should do that. Same thing with the next one, static def instead of def self dot method. That's also Ruby inspired, and now we're moving more in the direction of like JavaScript ES6. I've been through the fact that class bodies are no longer executable. Just quickly here, limited support for extending native tags. It has been added and it is supported now, but it is still kind of limited. There are some cases where it doesn't work exactly as you would guess. So it needs some more work. No support for extending SVG tags. That's basically part of web components. So we will need to support it in a different way. I don't think it's critical now, because you can do most of it with the functional tags that I showed earlier. Server-side rendering, that has also been rectified and implemented. It is even shipped now in Alpha 17 that I shipped an hour ago. Custom tags must be lowercase and include dashes, still a thing. We should set up a meeting and at least do an issue about how we want to. It's not difficult to support tags without lowercase and dashes, but if we still want to allow mount and unmount on them and things like that, then we will need to essentially rename it internally. So the problem then is that your styling, if you create an avatar tag, then it will in the browser actually be created as an avatar dash Imba component or whatever. And that would break the styling. Like if you think that you in an external CSS file can just style the avatar element. So that's a challenge there. Tooling even worse than with V1, that is rapidly changing. We still haven't released it yet, but we are working on VS Code Imba for version 2. And that's going to be one of the most powerful and important features for V2 as a whole, I think, because you get full auto-completion, full type inference, just like in TypeScript and JavaScript. So you get all of the power that VS Code and the Microsoft team has developed over the last 5-10 years, I guess. Yeah, still some edge cases with tag rendering that might give unexpected results. I need to continue work on adding tests to actually show these challenges and then fix them, obviously. Can I define event listeners as methods directly? That was a cool feature of Imba, but now that we have a really powerful syntax for setting up event handlers, I basically don't think it should be supported, but we need to have a discussion about that and think of at least ways to warn users and show them how they should set up events. Same with touch support. That was a feature we have used a lot in Imba, where you could just define on-touch start, on-touch update, and on-touch end on a tag. And it would automatically set up event bindings for kind of a touch format that unified mobile and desktop browsers. Again, talking about new features in new browsers, the actual pointer event API is pretty great. It's kind of fantastic, and it works in all browsers now. And it also supports pens and different like fingers and mouse, and there are so many customizable options and details you can get out of it. So it's a much better better API going forward. I guess that was it.
Yeah, that was it. We got through all of them.
Yeah.
And yeah, good stuff. We can move the other topics for next time, I think.
Yeah.
The remaining ones.
Yeah.
So we could go through the open issues then, and also the VS Code extension status.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to hear, like, are we going to wait until Imba is released, Imba 2, or are we going to start, maybe we should publish it as Imba instead, because the current one is published as Scrimba.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense to actually, could make sense to create it as a different, publish it as a different extension.
In the unlikely case we have to stay on Imba 1 for a long time.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I agree. But it's still very rough around the edges because it's so much like diagnostic stuff. It's the warnings are not being removed as you type. There are tons of weird things with it, but the basic concepts are working now, and I'm starting to move my work just like using it daily for my coding, and it's extreme. When it works, it's just fantastic. It's so much better than the old tooling. Even the Sublime Text tooling, which was what I use primarily for all my development.
Yeah, maybe I'll try using it soon.
Yep.
And then report bugs.
It could actually be nice to very soon, like this week, publish it on as a VS Code on the marketplace, because now it is still very cumbersome to run, because you need to I essentially still just run it in debug mode where I start it from VS Code. And
yeah, but like the messaging or everyone has this expectation Imba 2 is not ready for prime time.
Yeah, exactly.
So the extension is definitely not going to be ready for prime time.
Yeah.
And just make it clear in the description that this is not Imba 1. So if you're looking for Imba 1, go to this extension.
Yeah.
And this is bleeding edge, blah, blah, blah.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to the VS Code extension being merged into master. So
Me too.
We could just create a new branch for the V1 stuff and just protect the branch.
Yeah.
And then, I won't be doing stuff on that extension now that this new one is getting closer and closer, and it also looks much nicer. Yeah,
and just like the concept, just the fact that you have consistent go-to definition everywhere, it's just so powerful, especially for our large code bases like Scrimba and to a certain degree GitSpeak. Having the new developers start here, like you've started quite recently, it is still difficult to get around the code and understand what's happening in every step. So being able to jump to definitions everywhere and follow the
I think it's good to focus on one tool. Like if you look at Java, for example, like it's insane how good the tooling is. And people use IntelliJ. I don't know if you've tried it with all of the refactoring tools, moving, shuffling code around. It's insanely powerful. And you also have the concept of templates where you can just type a few keys and then it generates a lot of boilerplate code and so on.
That's also, so I come from the Ruby world, and I've always thought that you shouldn't need to create boilerplate code. Like Ruby is such a beautiful and terse, is that what you call it? Language. But I still see that it is nice to have support for good refactoring, like just renaming a variable or moving something out in a function or automatically adding some import statements.
Okay, so is there anything else we should add to the follow-up for next time?
When I went through the list now of improvements, I remember that we didn't, I haven't mentioned here the cool concept of the context API, which sounds like a complicated thing, like in React and Vue, but it's not. It's just a really nice, simple syntax to access any property defined on outer tags. And we can go through that later, but it's also a really nice improvement.
Yeah, so. Sounds good. Let's wrap up for today.
Cool. Thanks. Thank you.